So now, moving on to our next talk, I guess, while Harriet's bringing up the slides, um, we have Derek Posselt at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory talking about winds at different scales. And I first started talking to Derek about winds, I don't know, like 6 months ago, and I had no idea what we were getting into. I knew there were some, ways of using atmospheric sounders to look at water vapor and back out information about the vertical distribution of horizontal winds, and I thought that was pretty cool. And then we started talking, and he kind of blew my mind with all the possibilities and the different ways that we can retrieve information about atmospheric transport at many global to kind of local scales. And so I'm very excited that Derek was able to join us this week, and it's going to give us a crash course in observing meteorology across scales. Thank you, Derek.
Great. Thanks a lot, Nick. Yeah, so when I was asked to talk about this, I thought, goodness, I could talk for probably an entire day or more about this, and I've got to condense it into about half an hour. So I am going to give you a bit of a crash course. But really, the context for this is our entire workshop. And just in brief, the H of Z operator that Anna showed in her last talk, that's really what we want to get to here. And one of the themes of this workshop is how do we connect observations of the dynamics of the atmosphere to those concentrations and sources and sinks of greenhouse gases that are critical drivers of our climate system. So I'm going to tackle the meteorology side. And this first slide is meant to just highlight all of the different types of observations that we have available to us. But I want to start by grounding us in saying that what I mean by meteorology are measurements of the atmospheric state, so temperature and pressure, the dynamics, which is the three-dimensional wind vector components, although it is really hard to measure that vertical component of the three-dimensional wind vector, so really mostly we're after the horizontal vector components. And then water vapor. And I state water vapor is really the only trace gas that we typically focus on in meteorology. Obviously, many others are of importance to us, but that will be sort of the one that we'll include in meteorology. And I include that because it actually ends up serving as an important source of wind information for us. But it points us, I think, in a direction where we could leverage other observations of trace gases to infer winds and vice versa. And so this kind of gets at that question of covariability among variables in the system. So lots of different measurements here. I will go through these in sort of one by one just to give you an overview, but it comes from many sources. Anyway, let's just go ahead and get into it. Okay, so the very first thing that I'll talk about is measurements that are made in place or in situ, both on land and on ocean. So land, surface meteorological data is collected routinely at hourly or less time scales at about 11,000 sites over the globe. You can see in the right-hand plot there the locations of all of those surface sites as of about 2017. Now, they haven't changed much since then. In the animation in the center, this is from Global Ocean Survey, and this is showing you essentially everywhere on the globe that we're making water measurements. So it's not just oceans, it's also lakes and interior water bodies and such. But in addition to meteorological variables in the ocean, we also measure sea state, winds and sea surface temperature and other things, both at the surface and at depth. We won't talk much about at depth because really we're talking about those things that are sort of driving meteorological variables. So surface sites, that top left picture is a depiction of the automated surface observing system. It's automated surface weather stations that are deployed around the United States and the world, broadcasting that weather information on an automated sense. It used to be that someone would go out there and actually record this by hand and then transfer it by telephone. This is all automated now, as are the buoy measurements from NOAA and other agencies around the world, collected autonomously, transmitted via satellite, and ingested routinely into our models. But our models have a really hard time ingesting point surface observations. That's a topic I'm going to refer to several times, and I think Junji is probably going to talk about this as well, is from a data assimilation perspective, some of our most important measurements connected to that land surface or ocean surface atmosphere interaction are really hard to get into our models for a number of reasons. Okay, so in addition to surface-based observations in place or in situ, we also make measurements of the upper air or upper atmosphere. I kind of like this. I was doing a search for radiosonde launch pictures, and this one came up from 1936. And then in combination with, as part of one of the projects that I'm involved in, we also do radiosonde launches. This is outside of Colorado State University in 2024. Not a whole lot has changed with this sort of the way that we do this. Instrument packages have changed significantly, right? So you can see this person here has got essentially a telescope, and they're going to track the balloon as it goes, and then they're going to infer from where the balloon was by tracking by hand what the measurements of wind were. Now it's all electronic sensors with GPS and such, but these observations still form a really important backbone for the global observing system because they're one of the few things that we actually have that tells us what the state of the atmosphere was actually in place. Now, they're only made at about 1,300 sites globally. They decrease every year because these are not cheap to maintain. And so often, sort of countries are reducing their reliance on radiosonde observations. Obviously, also restricted mostly to land. And so oceans become a very big data gap in terms of our knowledge of the upper atmosphere. Part of that gap gets filled in by aircraft observations. So for quite some time now, the measurements that are made by aircraft in just sort of the routine way in which they gather data about their environment so that the aircraft stays in flight, keeps everyone safe, those measurements are now transmitted and used routinely in our estimates of meteorology. So in this case, you can also see, okay, so we get more information over the ocean, but the vertical profiling is concentrated near airports, right? So you get actually a vertical profile, kind of like a weather balloon observation, but it's as the aircraft ascends. And then you get quite a lot of information at that flight level. So about 10 kilometers up or so. So a lot of information at that level globally, and this happens routinely. Okay. Spaceborne observations. Anna showed the fleet from NASA. These are a list of all of the satellites that are operating routinely as part of operational weather prediction and observation by the various agencies. So a lot of research satellites, but in addition to those research satellites, which come and go, there is a backbone of the global satellite observing system which will stay in place for decades. Meteorological agencies plan out decades in advance. So NOAA's 2030s observing system has been set for quite some time. They know what they're going to build. They know what they're going to fly. They're now starting to work on the 2050s kind of time frame. So that gives you sort of the scale of sort of the planning that goes on there, which is in a way kind of tough because if we make new advances in how we make observations from space, it's hard to get those advances into what these operational agencies do. But it does mean that there are things that we can plan on and rely on. We know that they're going to be there barring disaster, et cetera. Strength of the in situ measurements was they gave us direct measurements of the meteorological variables at a location and time. Weakness of those is the representativeness. It's in a particular location, particular time, and you don't actually know how representative that observation is of the wider area. Satellite, on contrast, gives us global coverage. However, the weakness is that it's an indirect measurement. All you know is what radiation hit the sensor in your spacecraft. And you have to then infer from that information what the state of the atmosphere was that you were looking at. And that involves radiative transfer, it involves inverse problems, in some cases very ill-posed inverse problems. And that's what I'll start to get into next as we transition to a specific focus on winds. So this is courtesy of the European Space Agency. It's part of a presentation that I found online actually highlighting a mission that they're trying to get funded in the future. I'll talk about this in a little bit, but it's making measurements inside of clouds of winds. That's a really tough thing to do. I'll keep returning to that actually. But as we start to think about winds, we got to think about where are we getting this information? How accurate is it? and where are the gaps in our knowledge. And then this week, as we think about the connections between greenhouse gases and winds, we got to think about where do we actually most need that wind information. And I would say at the outset that unfortunately, I think in a lot of the cases where we most need the wind information is precisely where it's most difficult to get it. So that's something that I'm looking forward to discussing with everybody during the week. So the bottom line is that globally, there are millions of above-surface wind observations that you get about every 6 hours. So in the top there, and I'll get to how this works in the next few slides, we have information from satellite where you infer what the winds are by looking at time sequences of images, right? So if you see an image, another image, another image, another image of the same place, then if there are detectable features among those images, and you can track the distance between one feature in one image and that same feature in the next image, then you can use a whole set of different inverse problem techniques to back out what the vector would have had to be that would map that displacement, and then you have a horizontal wind in the atmosphere. So that's where the majority of our wind observations come from. Unfortunately, and I think that number that's plotted there, error in terms of meters per second, is really low. That's maybe after you filter everything that is pretty suspect out, maybe you'll get down to that 4 meters per second. In reality, I think the error is actually quite a bit bigger than that. Another way in which we get wind from satellite is direct measurement from spaceborne Doppler wind LiDAR. I'll talk more about this in just a second. So again, measuring the Doppler shift is a way to get motion. So if you send out an active pulse of radiation, either in the microwave or the visible, then if it reflects off of a particle, and then you can measure the frequency of that sort of signal versus what you've sent out, then that Doppler shift will tell you, at least along that line of sight, was that moving away or toward you. You don't know anything about what was happening perpendicularly, unfortunately. That's a limitation, but at least you have a direct measurement of what was happening there. So Aeolus, launched by the European Space Agency, was the very first one of these, routinely making measurements in space. It was hoped that the US would have a constellation of these. That didn't pan out. LiDAR is expensive. Aeolus lasted for 5 years. They actually did an intentional deorbit of this. I'll talk later about this. They're planning follow-ons from this. I did mention aircraft already and radiosondes, but as you go from sort of space down, you generally get fewer and fewer. So the direct measurements are fairly few. The indirect measurements are fairly large. Okay, so let's focus on spaceborne winds. And the reason that I'm going to make this focus is in part because we don't expect the distribution of surface, balloon, or aircraft observations to change a whole lot in the future. Whereas, potentially, if we make changes to the way that we make observations of measurements from space, we could potentially dramatically improve or change the way that we do wind. So I mentioned there's 2 ways of observing winds. Active and passive. Let's go ahead and take a look at passive to start. So again, as I mentioned, this is something that's been done for quite some time, ever since the launch of the very first geostationary satellite. So as soon as we had satellites that were located in an orbit where the orbital period is exactly at the Earth's rotation, we started to be able to get pictures of the Earth with fairly high time resolution. And so for a long time, we've been leveraging that information to detect winds. So the Cooperative Institute for Meteorological Space Studies at the University of Wisconsin has been one of the pioneers in this. So I'm going to show you a couple of case studies that they have on their website that just kind of nicely illustrate this. A little bit tough to see what we're looking at here, but if you look on the right-hand side, there's this sort of very faint orange or maybe salmon line there. That's the west coast of the United States. So this was a case study where they were looking at a really powerful storm over Hawaii. Hawaii's right about there. And so what you're seeing here in the different colors are winds at different heights. So geostationary satellites measure upwelling infrared and visible radiation. Different wavelengths in the infrared will peak at, the emission levels will peak at different sort of heights in the atmosphere. So by using 3 of those different wavelengths that have emission strengths in the infrared, you can essentially get 3 different layers of wind. And you can see in the upper right-hand corner, you have very upper troposphere, sort of middle upper troposphere, and sort of middle to upper troposphere in the green. And so A lot of information here. These are very dense vectors. Part of the problem, though, is if you look at those ranges there, that's a pretty accurate depiction of how uncertain the height assignment is. And so we know that there's wind. We know generally where that emission was coming from, but we don't really actually know how high that wind was. And if you want to use that information, a difference of 100 hectopascals in the vertical is pretty huge, especially when you get to the upper troposphere. But the nice thing is that as long as you have a time sequence of features with spatial overlap between the images and a time delay of about an hour or less, and you can resolve those features, and then you apply an image registration and feature tracking algorithm, you can back out winds. So it could be water vapor, could be anything. They also track the movement of clouds, that kind of thing. So a lot of coverage here, but the weakness is that there's pretty large uncertainties. I'll show you some quantitative results on that in just a second from some of the work we've been doing. Now, you might say, all right, so geostationary imagery is centered over the equator. You have to, because that's the only way you can make those orbit effectively in that geosynchronous orbit. What about the poles? Well, as it turns out, if you've got a bunch of low Earth orbiting satellites that are all orbiting over the poles, then you can do the same thing. So we have many, many different satellites that orbit over the poles. And so you've got the same kind of things, time sequences of imagery, which are displaced in time about an hour or less. And so then you can just take and do the same kind of time differences between those images, and you can back out winds. And so you can see that, where you have the winds, it doesn't fill that entire swath, and it's because you can only get the winds where you had overlaps between the two images. So you're going to have some places where you can't actually get it. But this was one of the advances that happened, I think, in the 90s. And it was one of the few things that when they brought it into global numerical weather forecast models, it was one of the few things that had a really major impact on their skill scores, because we simply didn't have information, and then suddenly we did. Okay, another technique for measuring winds from space is, as I mentioned, Doppler wind LiDAR. So uses the Doppler shift to tell you sort of motion toward and away the sensor. So Aeolus was a LiDAR that was flown by the European Space Agency, flown with two different wavelengths, one in the ultraviolet. So you have a laser operating in the ultraviolet, giving you that Doppler shift. And because it's operating in the UV, you actually have reflection off of the molecules in the atmosphere. Same thing that turns the sky blue. They're using that to actually look at the Doppler shift in the LiDAR signal, which is why you have observations all the way through the depth of the troposphere. Now, the amount of return that you get is proportional to the density of the atmosphere, which is also why you see that the bins increase in thickness as you go up, because you have to average more at those upper layers to be able to get the same kind of signal. But really robust measurement, fairly low uncertainty compared to other techniques, but extremely limited in terms of time and space. I mean, Anna showed the OCO sort of tracks, right? Very, very similar, right? So you have a LiDAR operating in a polar orbit. You get one, you don't get a swath, you get a curtain, and that's all you get. So, but very, very effective measurement. Aeolus is done. They're planning 2 more of these for the 2030s, each 5 years, following one after the other. So we're going to have a gap in LiDAR winds, but once we hit the 2030s, we should have them again. Now, the nice thing about the LiDAR winds is that they're, compared to feature tracking, relatively accurate and unbiased, and you know exactly the height that information is coming from, versus the feature tracking where you don't actually know that. Weakness, obviously, very limited coverage, and I'll come back to this later, but all of these dark colored areas, those are clouds. So, you look up at the sky, you can't see through clouds, visible wavelengths, neither can the LiDAR, and so from space you can't see through clouds. That's one of the drawbacks. I'm going to just do one slide on non-routine observations, because I've wanted to focus on sort of the operational constellations and then talk about sort of where are the gaps and where could we potentially go as a community. But I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about, oops, go back. And I think it's probably, there we go. Okay, so lots and lots of observations of winds that come from measurements that we don't make routinely, but we do in a targeted kind of way. So we come up with a science question, we determine where you need to go to make measurements to answer that science question, and then you go out and you carry out a field campaign. So upper center here is from a campaign that was done in 2021 called the Convective Processes Experiment, but focused on atmospheric winds, so CPEX-AW. This is from a LiDAR that was flown on the aircraft. Aircraft is flying at about 8 kilometers above the surface. And so in contrast to the Aeolus image that I showed you before, very, very fine vertical and horizontal resolution here. The kinds of things you can do from aircraft that you can't necessarily do from space. Wind speeds here comparing wind and direction, very, very precise, very accurate. This is the ESA mission that I was mentioning earlier, and this kind of gets at that problem of measuring winds in clouds. This is down to, I think there's 2 candidates left that ESA might fly, and I forget what the other one is, but this is called Wyvern. I can't remember what the acronym stands for. But if anyone in the room is familiar with CloudSat, this is the same frequency, 94 gigahertz, but it's a scanning Doppler radar. And so basically you're going to get winds inside of clouds, which is something we simply haven't had before. INCUS, investigation of convective updrafts. This is flying a constellation of small radars, only 30 or 90 seconds apart, looking at radar reflectivity at very short time scales, and looking at how that translates to vertical motion. And then from the ground, I'll redo this animation. Oops. There we go. You can implement new kinds of strategies to obtain winds. So for example, this is regular Weather Service radar showing us where a storm is. And then we have a phased array radar, which can scan very, very rapidly. And so you have the phased array radar is automatically tracking where those cells were in the Weather Service radar, and then giving you very rapid vertical scans through that through those clouds, and giving you very detailed depictions of what the motions in those clouds are. So technology advances, we find new ways of making measurements. This same kind of thing you could imagine potentially could be done with a Doppler LiDAR on the ground, scanning through the boundary layer to get you winds in the air reflected from particulates and such things. Okay, so moving on, I mentioned the observing system of the 2030s. For wind information, this is probably what's going to make the biggest difference, is instead of the geostationary satellites only measuring radiation in a few wavelengths, they'll be measuring infrared radiation in thousands of wavelengths. And by deconstructing the fine sort of details of that radiative spectrum, you now have, instead of broad layers where you're emitting radiation, you can then reduce those down to much thinner layers. And so instead of broad kind of estimates of water vapor and temperature, you'll get sort of much finer estimates of water vapor and temperature. So it's kind of like having radiosonde profiles every hour, everywhere you can see in all of these overlapped images. And remember, where we didn't have information was mostly over the global oceans in terms of water vapor, temperature, and wind profiling. This is going to be, we think, a really major advance in terms of our ability to know the state of the atmosphere, but also because if you can get resolved vertically images of water vapor at different levels and then track that water vapor at those different levels, now we've got 3D horizontal winds at a much larger number of locations than we had before. You go from, and in some of the estimates that we've been doing in my group, you go from something like, if you took sort of like a single snapshot in time and you said, okay, what are every single wind measurement we have currently, what is the fraction of the sort of pixels globally if you resolved it into, say, 10-kilometer pixels? What are the fraction of those pixels that you'd actually be representing? What's the yield? It's about 3% right now. Once we have the global geostationary ring of infrared sounders, it goes up to like 20%. So a major, major leap in the amount of information we have. Okay, so some of the persistent challenges, and this is where we've been kind of focusing a lot of our attention lately. If you look at the errors in winds that you get from tracking sequences of images, they're not entirely random. They're pretty systematic in a few ways, right? So what we have is on the left-hand side, so in both images, on the y-axis is the difference between an estimate of winds that we got by tracking features in a numerical model data set. So we have a reference, we know exactly what those winds were. Take the water vapor fields, track them using a feature tracking algorithm, and then compare back to that reference and say, how good did we do? And what are the relationships among the errors and other ancillary variables? And so what you see is that the wind error, as represented on the y-axis, is a pretty strong function of a couple of things. One is the moisture gradient. So this is the spatial difference in water vapor with respect to distance. And that makes sense, right? If you have a smaller gradient, a weaker gradient, you have less of a feature to track. And no image enhancement in the world is going to give you any information if you have a flat image. In fact, often what you'll do is you'll just enhance noise, and that doesn't help you. So the bulk of our errors actually occur where you have small gradients in water vapor. But this is the thing that popped out at us, which I think was really actually maybe the most interesting, is that if you look at the wind and how it blows compared to where the water vapor gradient was. So imagine I have lines that give me sort of values of water vapor, right? So I have low water vapor here, high water vapor here, and there are iso lines that divide those. If the wind blows perpendicular to those lines, then that feature moves exactly with the winds, and we have a pretty precise estimate of what that wind was. If the wind blows parallel to those lines, you can have a screaming wind velocity and have zero detected wind. And that's what this actually shows, is where you have a complete misalignment between winds and water vapor, you've got the largest errors. And by and large, it's always a negative bias. So you just simply can't get it. There was wind there, but there was no way for you to get at it with these feature tracking techniques. Okay, so here's where synergy comes in. We did a study where we essentially took a simulated data set where we had simulated LiDAR winds, simulated feature tracking winds, and we said, all right, let's see if we can learn a correction to the biases in the feature tracking winds using just a very small subset of LiDAR winds. And sure enough, when you train on enough data, and this was taking 3 months worth of co-located LiDAR and atmospheric motion vector winds and building a machine learning model that would characterize those biases. The original bias is in these orange bars here. And this goes from upper levels to sort of mid-troposphere to lower troposphere. You can see the bias gets lower as you get lower in the troposphere. By and large, that's because when you get down close to the surface, you have a lot more structure and you have a lot more water vapor. So the features get easier to track. As you go higher in the atmosphere, less water vapor structure, features get a lot harder to track, and you have much bigger biases. Plus, you have much larger winds up here. And so you can have very large winds blowing parallel to the water vapor contours, big biases. When you learn the correction from just a small amount of LiDAR, and by the way, this is a correction that was applied to places that had never seen LiDAR. It just was literally, we'd learned that functional relationship and then applied it. It knocks the bias down to just about zero. So in the same way as Anna was talking about, really leveraging those sort of relationships among variables, when we have different ways of measuring, we can leverage the joint information between them and get a much better estimate. Okay, I'm almost done. There are some significant gaps. I mentioned this at the beginning, and this is one of the challenges I think we're going to continue to face. So I'm curious actually as to where the greenhouse gas community most wants the winds, because I suspect that in some cases where we most need them might be some of the hardest places to measure. This figure is a little bit tough to interpret, so I'll walk through it just briefly. So this was comparing, as a sort of an estimate of how much error we have in current wind estimates. We just took a difference between two data assimilation produced wind estimates, one from the ECMWF and one from NASA. We said, where are they different, and where are the differences largest? So the red colors are any location where the wind difference was more than 5 meters per second and it was raining. So by and large, the main takeaway from this plot is that the winds have the most error in and around weather systems, where it's raining, where it's cloudy. And we saw that from the LiDAR as well, right? LiDAR can't measure underneath clouds. Turns out also that those infrared measurements that I was mentioning that we're going to be making from space also can't see through clouds. So anywhere you have cloud, you may have some trouble getting measurements of the three-dimensional structure of horizontal winds. The other issue, and you can kind of see it here, but it pops out in just about every data set that you have, is close to the Earth's surface, partly because that's where, by the time you get down there, you've had a lot of cloud potentially that gets in the way, but partly also that because we're measuring from space, and the closest to the surface is where you have the most noise, your signal's attenuated the most, it's extremely complicated. Plus, from an infrared perspective, if you have a temperature inversion anywhere in here, that really gets things complicated as well. So the hardest places to measure are inside of clouds and close to the Earth's surface. I suspect that second one is going to present some issues. Okay, so second to the last slide, making the connections between winds and greenhouse gases. That's what we're here this week to talk about. So globally, if you can measure greenhouse gases as imagery at high time resolution, there's a lot of wind information in that. And so in terms of covariability between different variables, that's something that we really ought to exploit. Conversely, if you're going to track greenhouse gases, you have to have winds. So that's, they're mutually interdependent. The question then that I think we need to start to wrestle with is, how much information on winds can we get if we're making better estimates of greenhouse gases? And what is the accuracy you need? And where do you need it to be able to constrain greenhouse gases and evolution? Just a couple of sort of base requirements. All you really need to get winds from greenhouse gas concentration measurements is somewhere on the hourly timescale difference, and then resolution of gradients. Once you have those, you can derive a wind. Okay, so summary slide. I know that I've given you kind of a crash course in this. There are a lot of ways to measure meteorological variables in winds. We're doing a pretty comprehensive job, but there are significant gaps that remain, mainly in the planetary boundary layer and in cloudy regions. Use of data fusion and bias correction strategies could certainly help us. Ultimately, this is something that I think, maybe we all agree on. If you have a really robust data assimilation system, maybe that would be the best tool because your model already represents a lot of those dynamics. You just need to constrain them. The problem is that we don't do a good job with data assimilation in cloudy regions. We're getting better, but we still struggle with that. And we still have a really hard time doing DA in the boundary layer due to deficiencies in parameterizations, the fact that the model surface might not be actually at the Earth's surface, lots of different problems there. Those problems are not going to go away anytime soon. Okay, last slide. Looking forward, in that chart that Anna showed of all of those missions, not a single one actually focused on winds in the troposphere, right? Some focus on ocean surface winds, certainly very, very important. I haven't touched on that much, but not a single one actually focused on winds. Winds are seen to be an enabling measurement or a component in science and applications questions, but not something that is crucial enough to actually just go after that particular measurement. So I'm thinking, you have to take a holistic perspective. Where can we use those measurements more effectively? And how can future measurements that we didn't make because we wanted winds actually give us wind information? All right. And then this will be in the slide deck, just a set of resources that if you want to learn more, you can go ahead and grab those. And with that, I'll stop.